Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections since we're recording it for broadcast on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. You're welcome to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to answer them online. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Jason Miller, Executive Editor of Federal News Radio.
Welcome to the panel discussion today. I'm looking forward to a timely and actually very informative conversation. Our guests today are Don Fries, the Director of the National Cybersecurity Investigative Joint Task Force at the FBI. John Felker, the Director of Operations for the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center at the Homeland Security Department. Jeff Massimilla, the Chief Product Cybersecurity Officer for Product Cybersecurity at the General Motors Company. And Brad Mederi, a Senior Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton. Before we get started, let me set a little context for our discussion today. Commercial and government organizations are facing an ever complex set of emerging cyber threats. It's not just phishing and denial of service, but data exfiltration, intellectual property theft. And as Keith Alexander, the former head of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, has said many times over the years, data disruption, the idea of changing information at its source, is one of the scariest potential attacks that's on the horizon. And speaking of attacks that are not just on the horizon but are actually here, we've seen ransomware, malware tunneling in IPv6 technologies, and of course, insider threats. In addition to these emerging threats, the attack surfaces are growing. We have mobility, the Internet of Things, industrial control systems. They're all giving agencies and commercial companies even more to think about and, of course, worry about. So with the growing attack surface and ever-increasing threats, agencies and commercial companies must change the way they protect themselves. That means agencies and companies need to move out of the defense-only posture and into more of a risk management resilience approach. Now, these are not new concepts, but most of us realize that protecting networks and data like we used to protect, where we do protect physical buildings, think of a castle with high walls and a moat, just isn't realistic. To that end, the White House recently updated Circular A130 with these concepts of risk and resilience. It pushes agencies toward understanding what are their most valuable cyber assets and what the best way to protect themselves through a risk management approach. But risk management's tough. A recent survey by the SANS Institute found implementing these concepts around risk management, both for the commercial and the government sectors, remains difficult. SANS says there are 4 main gaps: terminology, assessment, communications, and investment. Agencies are making progress with risk management. A recent survey by ISC Squared found 27% of the respondents say they have fully implemented the NIST cybersecurity risk framework, while 62% said they are in process of implementing the framework. And the one factor that connects all of these issues is people. All these changes depend on having a workforce with the right skill sets. That means hiring and training cybersecurity employees is getting obviously more difficult because the competition for these workers obviously is more intense. So with that context in place, let's again turn to our panel. Our panelists are Don Fries, the Director of the National Cybersecurity Investigative Joint Task Force at the FBI, John Felker, the Director of Operations of the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center at the Homeland Security Department, Jeff Massimilla, the Chief Product Cybersecurity Officer for Product Cybersecurity at the General Motors Company, and Brad Mederi, a Senior Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton. So gentlemen, let's start at the beginning. The threat landscape, it's changing, it's growing, we know that. What does it look like today? Let me start with Don, since you're right here. The FBI gets to see it all.
So Jason, when I talk about threat landscape, I really look at it from both the government and the commercial sector side, or private sector of the industry. Of course, it is growing. You talked about risk management, so I think that's probably a good place to start with that discussion. Although we see the attack surfaces growing throughout, we also see really a ground shift in how people are approaching, both from a government side and from a private industry side of things. That's to be encouraged. We see it more as a leadership paradigm shift rather than just technical. And so as that develops, as risk management starts to take hold, and NIST is a great example of providing a framework for that area, we've really got to see much more emphasis on leadership across the whole spectrum of an enterprise, and that counts for both government and private sector sides.
And when you say the leadership focus, it's from the CEO or the agency secretary on down, not just through...
So, right, it means 2 things, Jason. First of all, that leadership emphasis from the top down is important, but it also means recruiting and developing leadership from amongst folks who are technically competent, but as well as those who are business-minded and who understand how to quantify risk and how to make risk management something that works for a business, as well as the business of government. And that is a gap that is very challenging on both sides of the equation. The more that's done, and risk is quantifiable, a lot of times security, if security is just looked at singularly within any business organization, it's seen as a cost center, something that only costs and doesn't produce. if risk is managed holistically throughout an enterprise, it can actually be very productive, and it can be banked against other business lines, and it can be seen as an actual profit center. So we're encouraging that more and more, and we're seeing that start to develop, but we've got a long way to go in that direction.
John, let me turn to you, because DHS sees maybe the bigger picture as well, similar to what Don does at the FBI. When he talks about managed holistically, seeing the bigger picture where risk can be quantified, is that the risk issue relates back to the changing cyber threat landscape in many ways?
Yeah, I think so. I have to sort of pile on what Don said about the leadership being a critical element in the discussion about cyber threat and risk management. Leadership needs to own the problem. And Don said another thing that was kind of important in my view, and that is that we have to develop leaders that have technical skills. But to me, one of the things that's missing is there's a translation that has to occur between the technical folks that are doing the actual hands-on work and translating that into an understandable dialogue with the leadership in an organization, so that in the longer term, strategic plans, resourcing, and so forth can be properly allocated to those kinds of things, and making sure that they understand it's a business. At the end of the day, one of the things that we do, and this was highlighted in PPD 41, one of the things that we do is we have the asset response. The FBI has the threat response. The CTIC has the intelligence support to both of those responses. But one of the things that we do is we look at the asset response to sort of in a situation like at a fire. The fire department has to be there, but the police also have to be there to determine whether or not it's an arson. And so we are partnered closely on that, and we see that kind of thing all the time in terms of developing what's your risk, and then how do you structure yourself based upon that risk in that sort of context.
It's interesting you bring up the fire analogy. I know Andy Osmond, who obviously you work with closely at DHS, has used that analogy several times. I think he does a great job of always kind of helping people understand what's happening here. And from your perspective, are you seeing a bigger, is the cyber threat landscape growing? I mean, are there more fires to be put out?
I think there's no question about that, Jason. The things that we are trying to really focus on, and the things that we're seeing, are the connections between cyber creating physical effects. So, for example, in the Ukraine incident, where there was a cyber activity that caused the power outage in Ukraine. So we're looking at that very closely, and we're partnered, as I was talking to Jeff earlier, we're partnered with industry in the electric sector to take a look at how do we set up best to prevent a physical effect from occurring as a result of a cyber activity.
And I know that the Ukraine example is another one that we've heard a lot about over the last a year or so. Jeff, I'm going to skip you. I'm going to go to Brad real quick, because I think Brad's going to bring in both the both sides of the government side, but also what industry is seeing.
Yeah, one of the things that we see around the threat landscape is the barrier to entry continues to get lower. Criminal organizations can go onto the dark web and for less than $20 get a full exploit kit, malware, and can launch an attack very inexpensively, very quickly. So the barrier of entry gets lower. But we still see adversaries and threat actors, they're still focusing on the basics. At the end of the day, there's two key things that we see. One is people are still the weakest link. And we see constant phishing attacks against organizations and end users still clicking on those links and injecting malware and malicious code into the environment, and then it starts to move laterally. The second thing is unpatched systems. And I was talking to a CISO, and our clients are getting scanned thousands upon thousands of times a day. And as soon as an adversary finds an unpatched system, they immediately exploit it, and they're starting to traverse your enterprise. And so, there's sophisticated actors out there that have 0 days, that have the capability to do sophisticated exploits. But as John mentioned, it's a business. Attackers are going to take the path of least resistance. They want to get their fastest and cheapest so they can get what they're trying to steal or compromise and move on.
It's interesting you talk about patching, because there's been several stories recently, including one that we've written about the one agency who's been suffering with some serious patching problems, and the difference is, a lot of people tell me, well, how many is too many, and how many is critical versus non-critical. So from your perspective, I mean, when Booz Allen works with federal clients or commercial clients, but for this case, let's talk federal for a second. is the patching and the little things, the cyber hygiene, is that still the one that stands out to you guys as the areas of biggest, of the gaps?
I would say that we see at times agencies that don't even have a true understanding of what assets they have. And when you ask in terms of,
John's laughing not because of what you said, but because he knows it's true.
and John and his organization are helping to solve that problem. But the other thing that we see is when asking about the number of vulnerabilities, I think that's the wrong question in many cases, because it really comes down to understanding what are your high value assets. And if you're focusing on, from an enterprise perspective, trying to patch everything, you're spending a lot of money and may not get the results you want. I think it's really important to understand, really, what are those high value assets? What are those crown jewels that you have to protect, and really double down, making sure that they're secure, monitored, and controlled.
John, jump in.
I think that's right on the money. The understanding of what's your system, and then where are the really important parts of your system and the stuff in your system is part of that risk management framework discussion that has to occur. And it goes back to what I said earlier about the technical guys need to lead the leadership and have the leadership understand what's the business impact to doing this or not doing this. You can't protect everything, so you've got to choose based on some sort of risk calculus, what things are you going to protect first?
I want to turn to Jeff from General Motors. So you just heard this. We're not patching in the government. The government's struggling with understanding what their value assets are. Please tell me something's better at General Motors.
I think from a threat landscape, that's a really good question and good dialogue. And we work closely with the FBI and DHS and even our partners Booz Allen here to the side. The threat landscape is a very interesting activity at General Motors, because if you talk about the product perspective, you think about the product portfolio and what's changing in the automotive industry. You talk about autonomous cars. You talk about urban mobility, so urban active solutions that allow people to get from place to place in multiple modes. The landscape changes, and the landscape is a connected ecosystem, and that ecosystem goes from what would be a traditional back office server, all the way down to what happens on the product. But I think I can resonate what was said here around a risk-based approach and risk management. At General Motors, cybersecurity is a top-down activity, and when it becomes a top-down activity, you get the right resources, you get the right focus from a company perspective, and that allows you to make good risk-based decisions and protect your assets and get the right people and partners to help with that.
Do you get a sense that when you talk about top-down, when you have to go and talk to the board and say, I need money for this, or when you bring a cyber concern to a part of the General Motors that maybe is really excited about something new, flashy, about a new product in a car, do they understand, or is there still that kind of give and take where you have to maybe explain yourself a little deeper than maybe you think you need to?
No, I think at General Motors, cybersecurity is foundational to what we're doing in the product portfolio. So there isn't a discussion about do we need to make this product secure before we launch it. It's a discussion around what do we need to do and how do we do that in a development process to ensure that we have security built in right from the beginning, and then we have the ability to manage security throughout the life cycle of that product. Because when we launch a product, it sits on the road for 11 years or longer, and it's connected for that period of time. So it's not a matter of having it secure when you launch it. It's a matter of having it secure throughout that product life cycle.
It's just, you bring up autonomous cars, we could have a whole different discussion about that. Sure. But I think that's one of the big concerns about cybersecurity. Could you hack into a car? And I know, again, another time. Let me turn to Don for a sec about this idea of managing the cyber risk and understanding assets. When you guys at the FBI are called in to help, or when you guys are given a warning about a cyber threat or vulnerability, do you get people coming back to you, or is that John's problem? I mean, in the sense of, well, what do I protect first? I mean, give me a sense of how, if people are understanding these, like as Jeff kind of described.
So yeah, we're not going to make the consultative assessment or suggestion on how to mitigate, and over to we would talk to John and his folks about that, particularly for the .gov space. But I think the core of your question is how are we quantifying things? I think everybody made this point. Both Brad and Jeff really tied one thing together that makes a lot of sense to understand about this, is that security, if it's built in from the development stage, makes an entire difference to both attack surface and where the threat comes from and how the threat acts. Brad talked about how things get more and more simple all the time. That's that leadership piece. leadership to handle and understand just exactly how to prioritize what the risk is and how to mitigate from a level that makes sense financially and that will help the business still be in the development side. Jeff's developing products. That relationship between development and operations is critical. Having security fundamental to it, you can't do better than that. So let's talk specifically about your question. When we come into an environment, and this was John's point, many times the victims that we're dealing with don't understand what they have, where it's located, or how vulnerable it is. And that's a failure in leadership. That's not a technology problem. That's not it's not a development problem. That's simply a company, an enterprise, or an organization's inability to know themselves. And so that needs to be one of the key discussion points for any group. I think if General Motors is leading in that direction, and they're handling that from an executive level all the way down to the engineering and development side. Jeff happened to be an engineer in production, building these systems before he came to the security side. That is a best practice for the industry, and you don't see that done everywhere. I know we may talk about IoT and other things down the line, but it's those fractals to endpoints where people can access things where no one knows where their risk really lies. That's what results in myself and John's teams coming in to do not only investigation for attribution, but also for a big mitigation operation. That's why we work so closely together. Those things could have been handled very, very simply through some of Brad's points, though.
Brad.
Yeah, just a quick point. Don was talking about when intelligence and insights, when they get those about specific threats. I think one of the things that the industry has really been grappling with is how do you operationalize intelligence? And 2 or 3 years ago, we were providing threat intelligence to organizations, and in many cases they didn't know how to operationalize it. We're seeing a big shift in the industry to taking intelligence, being able to enrich it, tying it closely with security operations, so that you can do more proactive, have a much more proactive posture and defense in place, so that you turn to being able to understand the threat landscape, how it's evolving, and maturing your security posture in a quick way to be able to respond to that.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and maybe we'll come back. We'll pull on that string a little bit of operational intelligence. You're listening to the panel discussion, Emerging Cyber Threats in Government, sponsored by Booz Allen Hamilton on federalnewsradio.com at 1500 AM.